What if we've been telling the wrong story for centuries? Not just a small error, but a foundational myth taught in schools, written in history books, passed down as truth. The story of the German people, their ancient roots, their proud tribal ancestors, their rise through the mists of prehistory. But what if, deep inside the bones of their ancestors, there's a different story? One that history never told? Not carved on monuments, not in folklore or maps, but encrypted in the spirals of DNA. Because when scientists tested the ancient genomes of Europe, they found something no textbook had predicted. Modern Germans don't just descend from Germanic tribes. In fact, their story goes far deeper and far east. Roughly 4,500 years ago, a mysterious group from the Eurasian steppe exploded into Europe. Riders on horseback. They carried not only weapons and wagons, but something far more powerful, their genes. And, in a stunning twist, those genes, those steppe markers, make up a huge portion of the modern German genome. Not a footnote, not a fringe lineage, a foundation. This wasn't supposed to happen. According to the old story, the Germanic peoples were born in the dark forests of Central Europe, pure, rooted, untouched. But DNA says otherwise. It whispers a different origin, one that doesn't start in Europe at all. And here's the real question. If our genetic inheritance rewrites our origin stories, whose version of history do we believe? The one taught in classrooms, or the one buried in our bones? Because this steppe ancestry didn't arrive alone. It collided with something already ancient, something already living here. And that leads us to a forgotten fusion, one that's even stranger than this first contradiction. Long before the first Germanic tribes even formed a name, three invisible forces were already shaping the bloodlines of Europe. Not kings, not armies, but peoples, forgotten by time, whose bones still carry the signatures of an ancient trinity. The first were hunters, wild, silent, moving through icy forests thousands of years ago. The second, farmers, crossing from the Near East, bringing wheat, cattle, and the first villages. And then came the third, the horsemen of the steppe, the Yamnaya, the same group whose DNA stormed across Europe and into modern German veins. But here's the twist. When scientists sequenced a 7,000-year-old skeleton from Germany, they didn't find a single tribe. They found a mosaic. A woman whose DNA revealed she was both a farmer and a hunter. A living fusion long before any steppe nomads arrived. It shattered the idea that Europe's gene pool was built one layer at a time. Instead, it looked more like a river delta, branching, blending, unpredictable. That one skeleton became a time capsule, not of conflict, but of coexistence. Because it turns out, our ancestors weren't divided by labels. They were defined by survival, by merging, by mixing. And that's the quiet revelation here. Your DNA isn't a bloodline. It's a conversation across time, a gathering, a genetic memory of people who may have never met, but still became part of you, feasting together, farming side by side, sharing myths, meals, maybe even mothers. So if Europeans were always a blend, a gathering of peoples, then why, much later, did the idea of a single Germanic identity become so powerful? What made that fusion freeze into something fixed? And who decided what it meant to be truly German? The answer lies deeper in time. And it starts with the most powerful migration Europe had ever seen. They came like a storm, fast, fierce, and silent. Not in war, but in waves. The steppe people, the Yamnaya, nomads from the Pontic Caspian grasslands, east of the Black Sea, horse riders before cavalry even had a name. They didn't leave behind temples, scrolls, or grand monuments, but they left something far more permanent, their blood. Because when their DNA was discovered across Central Europe, researchers didn't just see a trace, they saw a takeover. Within just a few generations, nearly 70% of local male lineages had been replaced. That's not evolution, that's revolution. The Yamnaya didn't just arrive, they reshaped. They brought animals, carts, and above all, language. The roots of Indo-European speech, ancient words that would splinter into Latin, Celtic, and Germanic. This was no gentle mixing. It was a collision. Imagine it. Settled farmers, living quiet lives in river valleys, suddenly faced with fast-moving riders, new rituals, strange tongues. The clash wasn't just cultural, it was biological. In that chaos, something unexpected happened. Europe didn't fracture, it blended. The blood of the farmers, the rhythm of the steppe, the myths of the forest tribes, they all merged into what we now call European identity. But every wave leaves something behind or washes someone away. So now we have to ask, if the Yamnaya rewrote the genome of a continent, who vanished and who survived? To tell the next chapter. For centuries, we imagined them as pure. The Germanic tribes, isolated, ancient, noble, sprung from deep forest roots, untouched by outsiders, but DNA tells a different story. And it starts in the soil beneath their feet. When scientists studied ancient graves in southern Germany, they expected tribal cohesion. What they found was a family tree tangled across regions. Mothers with ancestry from the Alps, children with DNA linking to Celtic regions, fathers showing ties to Scandinavia and the Balkans. This wasn't a closed tribe, it was a network. So-called Germanic groups, like the Alemanni, the Suebi, even the Goths, weren't genetically sealed units. They were porous, adaptive, blended, and this changes everything. Their rituals, some borrowed, their weapons, hybrid styles, even their burial rites mixed, a Roman influence with local tradition. So what does this mean? It means that Germanic wasn't a bloodline. It was a banner, a shared idea, built by people who didn't all look the same, speak the same, or come from the same place. Identity was not a fence, it was a fire, gathering different people under one warmth. And that's the twist most never see. The more we search for purity, the more we find complexity. So if these tribes were already mixed, already part Celtic, part steppe, part Romanized, then the real question isn't where Germans came from. It's when they began to see themselves as one. It's easy to picture conquest, Roman soldiers marching north, armor gleaming, order-crushing chaos. But that's not the story the DNA tells. Because when the Romans pushed into Germania, they didn't just bring war, they brought people, traders, slaves, soldiers from every corner of the empire. North Africa, the Middle East, Gaul, Iberia. And some of them stayed. Their bones now lie buried beneath Central European soil, next to local elites, not separate, side by side. In one grave, a noblewoman buried with Roman jewelry, but carrying northern ancestry. In another, a warrior with Middle Eastern DNA holding a sword in Germanic style. This wasn't assimilation. This was fusion. As the Roman Empire fractured, new powers rose in its shadow. But instead of replacing old bloodlines, they layered them. Post-Roman Central Europe became a patchwork. Interwoven genomes, hybrid traditions, shared graves. The languages changed, the gods changed, even the architecture changed. But something else was forming underneath it all. Something strange. Even in all this mixing, this melting pot of tribes, invaders, and colonists, a singular identity began to rise. Germanic. Not as a genetic truth, not as a pure origin, but as a story people began to believe. A cultural shape, a shared memory, a name that would bind clans, villages, eventually, nations. So how did that identity survive? How did it grow when the bloodlines beneath it refused to stay still? To find that answer, we need to leave behind bones and borders and follow something more slippery. Language. You can lose a war, you can lose your home, but sometimes your words survive. Because language is viral. It travels faster than blood, farther than memory. And in ancient Europe, it spread like fire across dry grass. The Indo-European language family, the one that would birth Latin, Sanskrit, Slavic, and yes, Germanic, didn't spread through textbooks. It moved on horseback, The Kurgan hypothesis tells us that pastoral nomads from the steppe brought not just their genes, but their words, into valleys, into forests, into hearts and homes. And something incredible happened. Even as their DNA dissolved into the melting pot of Europe, their languages endured. Languages that split and evolved, but kept echoes of a common ancestor. That's why an Dawi English speaker and a German speaker, and even someone in Iran, still share traces of the same ancient tongue. It's why we say mother and Germans say Mutter. It's more than coincidence, it's inheritance. But here's where identity plays its trick. Because long after the steppe genes became just one layer of many, the Germanic language became a powerful symbol, a tool of unity, a cultural glue, a banner people could rally behind even when their DNA told 10 different stories. That's the paradox. Language defines tribes, even when their bloodlines don't match. So when someone says, "I am German," what are they really claiming? Blood, words, or something deeper? And if language can outlive lineage, then what happens when the two no longer match at all? We think we know who we are. We hold passports, speak native tongues, point to borders and say, "This is where I belong." But then the DNA results come in, and the story changes. Because when geneticists mapped the genomes of modern Germans, they didn't find a straight line. They found a spiral, winding through thousands of years, through migrations, through forgotten names, high amounts of steppe ancestry, still alive in modern blood, remnants of those horse riders who once thundered into Europe. But they're not alone. That same genome also carries ancient markers, from Near Eastern farmers, from Paleolithic hunters who tracked prey beneath glaciers, from Neolithic women who lived and died before a single stone city rose. And now, DNA testing companies, from Ancestry to 23andMe, have begun breaking Germany into sub-regions. Northwest Germans, more Celtic mix, Bavarians, hints of Eastern Alpine DNA, Thuringia, a blend echoing Central European waves. But here's the twist. These categories aren't walls, they're gradients. And when scientists look closer, they find connections, not divisions. Germans share significant genetic overlap with Danes, Dutch, Czechs, even Swedes. The genome doesn't honor political maps. It draws circles across rivers, tribes, languages. So you may be more Scandinavian than you thought, more Eastern European than you ever knew. Not because your story is broken, but because it was never simple to begin with. Your DNA isn't a line, it's a landscape, layered, messy, beautiful. But that raises a bigger, thornier question. If genetics paints such a shared picture, how did we ever draw such hard lines between nations? How did something so fluid become so fixed? Maps are clean, borders are bold, lines drawn in ink, defended with blood. But DNA has no respect for maps, because when researchers overlay genetics onto history's borders, something strange happens. The Holy Roman Empire? Its genetic footprint is scattered, inconsistent. People living inside its heart often share more ancestry with those outside its edge. Kingdoms like Prussia, Bavaria, Saxony, each drew hard lines on paper, while their people quietly intermarried across them for centuries. And that's the paradox. Nations are built on separations. Genomes are built on mixing. People draw lines. Genes cross them. In southern Germany, some villages are genetically closer to Czechs and Austrians than to their northern German counterparts. In border zones, entire communities define national identity with every chromosome. The Alps didn't stop love. Rivers didn't stop trade. Wars didn't stop families. And now, in the age of genetic truth, we can see the full picture. It's not a puzzle of separate pieces. It's a mosaic, a tapestry woven by centuries of migration, alliance, and chance. And yet, despite this overwhelming genetic overlap, we cling to national myths, to labels, to flags, to the idea that blood should match borders. So what happens when we finally admit that it never did? What does that mean for identity? When history says we're different, But genetics says we're the same. So now we arrive not at an answer, but a mirror. What does it truly mean to be German? Is it blood, language, the soil beneath your feet? Or is it something else, something far harder to trace? Because the genome doesn't lie, but it doesn't explain everything either. It shows us threads: hunter, farmer, nomad, steppe riders, alpine mothers, Roman merchants, Viking shadows. It shows us the collision of cultures, and the long, quiet blending of them too. But it doesn't tell us when someone decided to draw a line and say, this is German, and this is not. It doesn't tell us how language became a tribe, how stories became borders, how identity became a uniform. The textbooks gave us a clean story: proud tribes, pure lineages, neat categories. But DNA pulled back the curtain and showed us a beautiful mess. A map of overlaps, a history made of migrations, fusions, forgotten names. Maybe identity was never meant to be a single thing. Maybe it's always been a conversation between who we are and who we think we are. And maybe, just maybe, that's not a weakness. It's a strength. Because the truth is, we are all made of many people. And the deeper we dig, the more we realize we're not finding purity. We're finding connection. So as the story of being German continues to evolve, one question still lingers. If your ancestors were a mosaic, then who else's story is buried in your own? Next time, we go further, beyond borders, beyond blood, to ask another question, not just about Germans, but about everyone in Europe, because the story of us is still being written, in our DNA, and in the stories we dare to tell.